Okay, everybody. I think we'll begin now. You're here for a wonderful class about Jewish music by Seth Kibel, who's great at doing that. Um, I am not Seth Kibel. I'm Jerry Garfinkel, and I'm the treasurer and the technical director of the study center. Seth, can you let people in while I'm talking?
I'm way ahead of you, Jerry.
Okay, very good. I'm probably going backwards. Um, okay. So anyway, as treasurer, I have to tell you that our classes are free. They're all pretty good, but they're free. But we do have expenses. So we encourage donations. We don't require donations. We do encourage them. And if you want to donate to us, go to our website, which is www.jewishstudiescenter.org, and click on donate, of course. And then you can donate from your credit card or from your PayPal account or by check. If you click on check, the website will tell you where to send your check. Okay. Um, that's my treasurer stuff, I believe. Now, as tech stuff, as you probably realize, this class or this session is being recorded. So I will cut off the stuff that started before we actually began the class. And then the recording will be posted on YouTube. And I'll send an email to all the registered students with the link to the recording. It'll be in a day or two. We have closed captions on. So if you find it hard to understand my still New York accent, I guess, you can look at the captions. Are muting everyone, but we do want your questions and your comments. Please put them in the chat box. Address them to everyone. Sometimes you put in the question, someone else may answer it or make a comment on your comment. So put it in for everyone. After the official part of the performance session is over, we'll have a Q&A session. I mean, Seth may answer some of your questions earlier, but Bessie will have a Q&A afterwards. And I think Mindy Reiser, who is our vice president, will run that. I think that's about it. Last week, I introduced this speaker. I prefer if Mindy does it because I can't pronounce these French words very well at all. I used to be able to pretty easily read mathematics in French, but reading a newspaper or pronouncing something in French is way beyond me. So, Mindy, if you're around, I will let you take over and
Okay.
introduce Seth.
Okay. I hope you can hear me, folks out there
We hear you fine.
in internet land. Okay. It's a delight to be with you on this freezing day. And our hearts will be warmed by Darius Milhaud. And Seth is convinced that we will find our new favorite Jewish composer, when we hear about Darius Milhaud and his compositions. Let me say a little bit in introduction about Milhaud. He wrote in his memoir the words, "I am a Frenchman from Provence and by religion a Jew." And that was written in 1942 while he was on a transatlantic sea journey to America. As many others in Europe, he was forced by the Nazis to flee. And he really had a warm and deep affection for France. His work encompassed his life in two continents, Europe and America, with a wide array of musical influences, very much encompassing his Jewish heritage, jazz, and dual roles as a composer and educator. A little bit of background on Darius Milhaud, you will hear more from Seth Kibel. who is our speaker. Seth himself is a musician, and he plays woodwind instruments and works with some of the best bands in klezmer, jazz, swing, and more. So Seth reveals to us the musical gifts of many musical traditions. He has been wowing audiences with his playing on clarinet, flute, and saxophone. He's made a name for himself in the Baltimore, Washington area and beyond. He performs with such groups as the Klestet, the Bay Jazz Project, Music Pilgrim Trio, the Natty Bow, and more. Very, very clever name, Seth. He's won 28 Washington area music awards. They're called WWIIs. Do I have that right? Including Best World Music Instrumentalist and Best Jazz Instrumentalist. His most recent recording, with the interesting title, Clown with a Stick, was released in May 2023 on the Azealia City recording label. And he's won numerous awards in the Mid-Atlantic Song Contest, including the Grand Prize in 2016 and a Gold Prize in 2022. When he's not performing, he frequently lectures on a variety of topics in music history for numerous institutions, including O'Share Lifelong Learning at Johns Hopkins and Towson Universities. And now let's hear from Seth.
All right. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Jerry. Whoop. I just got unspotlighted. There we go. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before we proceed, Popper, a couple of quick things. I know Jerry went over this, but let me just mention this again. Due to the sheer numbers tonight in this Zoom room, we are mercilessly keeping everyone muted. And should you attempt to unmute, Jerry or Mindy with lightning fast reflexes will mute you once again. And they will say it pains them to do that, but that is a lie. They derive great pleasure from it. Nonetheless, I fully encourage you to avail yourself of Zoom's chat feature. In fact, I recommend you go to the bottom of your screen, hit that chat button right now so it's right off to the side of your screen. And at any point in my presentation, you can feel free to type almost whatever you want in that chat. Any questions, comments, technical concerns, glitches, quandaries, conundrums, whatever. And I may not see it right when you type it, but I'm pretty good at multitasking, so I'll be kind of keeping an eye on that chat window as I go along, and will do my best to address everything pertinent contained there within. And, if I miss anything at the end, Mindy or Jerry will be sure to let me know so I can address everyone's relevant questions and comments. Okay, another quick preliminary remark. I consider myself pretty knowledgeable about Darius Milhaud and his music. However, je parle un peu de français, mais je ne parle pas français très bien. So yes, it is very possible over the course of this presentation, I may slightly butcher the pronunciation of a certain French name or French place or French composition title or something like that. Please be generous and gracious in your assessment of me in that regard. I'm hitting the Duolingo as much as I can. My French is getting better, but I've got a ways to go. Okay, so as Mindy already set up for you, Darius Milhaud is a fascinating and wonderful Jewish/French/American/ a lot of things composer, and one who I think is relatively underappreciated and under-recognized to this day. I mean, in general terms, he's one of the 20th century's most prolific composer. Over 450 numbered works, 15 operas, 17 ballets, 13 symphonies, 18 string quartets, a partridge in a pear tree, and more. His work encompasses a myriad of musical influences representing his French heritage, his Jewish heritage, Latin American, Brazilian influence, dance rhythms, and yes, as we'll talk about, American jazz. And while it's hard and it pains me to reduce Darius Milhaud to a single work, it is important to note that his most famous composition, with which many of you may be familiar, La Création du Monde, a ballet score, The Creation of the World, is really a remarkably historically significant work because it is a work for the concert stage that combines classical music and jazz, much in the way George Gershwin did in Rhapsody in Blue. Yet it actually premieres in Paris 3.5 months prior to the premiere of Rhapsody in Blue in 1924. You know, to this day, and I'm not trying to diminish anything George Gershwin accomplished, and I'm not trying to downplay the significance of Rhapsody in Blue, because it's hard to overstate the significance of Rhapsody in Blue, but when people cite it as the first concert work to combine jazz and classical music, that is patently not true. Darius Milhaud deserves that credit. Okay, let me do some real brief biography of Milhaud because we have limited time and I want to make sure we get to some music before too long. All right, there he is. Darius Milhaud was born September 4th, 1892, in Marseille, actually, but he grows up in this very unique region in central France called, and I might be mispronouncing this a little bit, Aix-en-Provence, which is a region of the Comté de Venaissin. Basically, this is this region in France that has this almost unique, insular Jewish culture. Which was almost completely wiped out during World War II. Basically, the Comté de Venaissin, this little county, has 3 towns that were mostly Jewish. The main town was Carpentras, where Darius Milhaud is from. And Provençal Jewry, as it's known, is its own unique subset of Jewish culture. It is neither Ashkenazi nor Sephardic. It has its own music, its own dialect, a mixture of Hebrew and Provençal, which is in itself a French dialect. In fact, much of what we know of this unique kind of niche Jewish culture comes from Darius Milhaud, as well as his wife, Madeleine Milhaud, who also hailed from this region in Aix-en-Provence. The Milhauds were a prominent family in this region. His great-grandfather was one of the founders of the synagogue, gave the inaugural address in 1840, conducted the first census of Jews in France in 1840. In fact, Darius Milhaud was commissioned to write a work and to return to Aix-en-Provence to celebrate the centenary of this temple, but of course the war prevented that from happening. As Mindy already mentioned, Darius Milhaud starts his 1942 autobiography with the sentence in translation, of course, "I am a Frenchman from Provence, and by religion a Jew." By the way, this is a fascinating autobiography. Maybe I'll get a chance to talk about it a little more later. He comes from a solidly middle-class household. Both his parents played music. His father founded the Musical Society of Aix-en-Provence. His mother had studied classical voice in Paris. He begins playing violin. Darius begins playing violin when he's 7 years old. He starts composing when he's 13 years old. And when he's 16 years old, he goes to Paris to begin his composition studies at the famous Paris Conservatoire, where he studied with such significant teachers as Leroux, Vincent Lendy, Paul Ducasse, and others, and yes, even briefly Arnold Schoenberg. You may have heard this just as a remark, but sadly, much of Arnold Schoenberg's original scores were destroyed over the past week in the California wildfires. Of course, the compositions haven't been lost. They have been documented and digitized and whatnot. But it is one of the many tragedies that has happened this past week in California. Interestingly enough, this is another aside. Darius Milhaud occupies an interesting position in 20th century modern classical music. Because as you know, if you were a 20th century classical composer, there were two camps. You either were part of Camp Schoenberg or Camp Stravinsky. Those two men hated each other, both professionally and personally. In fact, events had to be scheduled so they weren't in the same room at the same time. And Darius Milhaud is really interesting because personally, he was close friends with Arnold Schoenberg for his entire life. In fact, he dedicated an early string quartet to Schoenberg. He conducted the Paris premiere of Pierre Lunaire in 1921. But stylistically, Darius Milhaud bears a little more in common with Igor Stravinsky. Okay, World War I happens. Darius Milhaud is declared ineligible for military service and spends the service working in a hostel for refugees. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, brings me to the first work I want to highlight. You know, Darius Milhaud always was very proud of his Jewish heritage and never shied or ran away from it. But there are actually only a handful of works in his oeuvre that directly relate to his Jewish heritage. But interestingly enough, one of his earliest works and his final work are both overtly Jewish. So let's start with that early work. A work he writes when he's 24 years old, his Poème Juif, Jewish poems for voice and piano, Opus 34. Ernest Bloch wrote a Poème Juif a few years earlier that may be a work you're already familiar with. It's arguably the more famous work with that title. Nonetheless, in 1916, Darius Milhaud writes a work as well. Now, there is some confusion, I have to say, about where these poems actually come from. They're in French. They're sung in French. Some say they were adapted from poets by his friend Albert Cohen, who is a Swiss Jewish author and poet. Some people say it was Max Jacob, who was born Jewish but converted. That's a whole nother story, French poet and painter. And there's a question of whether they wrote some of these poems or adopted them from other Hebrew texts. For his part, in his autobiography, Darius Milhaud says that these were anonymous Hebrew poems that he found and then translated into French himself. I don't know the real answer to that. I just want to highlight one of them right now real quick because they're quite interesting. There's 8 different poems, and each one he dedicates to a different person, figure, or influence in his life. And the one I'm going to play for you right now is number 7, the Chant de Forgeron, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, which he dedicated to his friend, the great pianist, originally from Poland, Arthur Rubinstein. So this is a recording from just a few years ago. Baritone Holger Falk, pianist Stefan Schleichermacher. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And what I'm going to do is put the lyrics up on the screen while I share the audio of the recording. This is a complicated screen share. Hopefully I'll get it right. Now, I do have to apologize. I have the French lyrics. I couldn't find a good translation of these lyrics anywhere, so I put these lyrics through Google Translate, which, as you well know, is an imperfect method of translation. So if these lyrics aren't quite right, please be forgiving in that regard. All right, let me get this going. I'm going to share the lyrics, and then I'm going to share the audio of the 7th of these songs. All right, and now let me do this. Oh, pardon me one second. I have to do this. Okay, that's the poem Juif. Okay. In January 1917, actually not long after that work is premiered, a pivotal moment happens in Darius Milhaud's early development. The French government back in this time period was very supportive of arts and culture. But they were supportive of arts and culture in a really interesting way. It wasn't like you might have a country do today where they give grants and programs and sponsor events and concerts. No, they would give cushy government jobs to artists. The French government during this time period was filled with people in the civil service who were musicians, composers, painters, artists. Really, I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm prepared to accept an ambassadorship anytime someone wants to offer it to me. So in 1917, a good friend of Darius Milhaud, the poet and author Paul Claudel, is named ambassador to Brazil. And he needs to take an assistant, an associate, a secretary, as they say, with him. So he chooses his good friend, Darius Milhaud. So indeed, for 2 years, the French diplomatic mission to Brazil consists of a poet and a musician. Now, like any good musician, when Darius Milhaud is in Brazil, he soaks up all the sounds that he hears down there. And when he gets back to France in 1919, he premieres a work that really would put him on the map as a composer, and it's one of his more famous works to this day. And that is the ballet score, Le Bœuf sur le Toit, The Ox on the Roof. This is a surrealistic ballet from an idea by Jean Cocteau, the great French thinker, who was an important influence on Darius Milhaud. And in this ballet score, Darius Milhaud uses snippets of Brazilian folk songs and Brazilian rhythms and all the sounds that he had heard while serving as the secretary to the ambassador in Brazil for those 2 years. And this ballet score makes a huge splash in 1919 in Paris and puts Darius Milhaud kind of on the map as a cutting-edge young French composer. And I'm going to play part of it for you in a minute. And one of the things I always like to ask people to do, and this is almost impossible, but try to listen to this work with contemporaneous ears. Meaning, we have all heard Brazilian music, and certainly lots of music influenced by Brazilian music in our lifetime. But try to imagine, if you can, what this may have sounded like in 1920, or 1919 rather, for French listeners who had not heard anything remotely like this. This ballet score was a musical revelation, and it's quite wonderful. I'm going to show you actually a little video clip of the Orchestre de Paris from a few years ago, conducted by Alondra de la Parra. Let me get this queued up. This is actually a video clip, and I'll play just a few minutes of this. La Bouffe sur le Toit. All right, I'm going to stop it there. My apologies. Whoops. Hold on. There we go. My apologies. It does pain me to do that when I do my classes on kind of jazz or blues or klezmer or some of those other genres, when I talk about a recording, I can play it. I can play the 2.5 minute or the 3 minute recording. You can hear it in its entirety. When I do classes like this on classical music, obviously I'm dealing with works that are much longer, so I have to play you excerpts. And it pains me to do that because really these works should be listened to and appreciated in their entirety. So if anything you hear over the course of this presentation piques your interest, please go listen to it. It's in its entirety, and I guarantee you will be richly rewarded for doing so, in a spiritual and karmic sense, of course, not financially. And yes, some of that syncopation, some of those Brazilian rhythms, to my ear, is somewhat evocative of the kind of Latin American influenced music Aaron Copland would be writing about 30, 40 years later. But that's what puts Darius Milhaud on the map. Throughout the 1920s, Darius Milhaud becomes a leading French composer and is grouped in with a group of 5 other young, innovative French composers, and together they become known as Les Six, or the Six. The 6 French composers lumped together in this category are Darius Milhaud, Francis Poulenc. They're the 2 most famous members, I would argue. Arthur Honegger, Georges Auric, Germain Taillefer, and Louis Douret. Let me get a photo up here to show you. There they are. Hopefully you can see my cursor, but going clockwise from the top left, there you have Francis Poulenc, there's Germain Taillefer, there's Georges Auric, Louis Douret, and then Arthur Honegger. Jean Cocteau is in there. He's the honorary 7th member. And there's Darius Milhaud seated right there. The members of Les Six kind of made it a pastime throughout their lives and careers to chafe at being lumped together. They would often argue that was an arbitrary distinction. The name came because it was a French music critic who reviewed a concert where all 6 of them had their works played. The reviewer is named Henry Colette, and he dubbed them Les Six, and that nickname stuck. Darius Milhaud, in that autobiography, writes, Colette chose 6 names, absolutely arbitrarily, those of Auric, Douret, Honegger, Poulenc, Taillefer, and me, simply because we know each other and were pals and appeared on the same musical programs, no matter if our temperaments and personalities weren't at all the same. Auric and Poulenc followed some ideas of Cocteau, Honegger followed German Romanticism, and myself, Mediterranean lyricism. Look, notwithstanding their protests, it does kind of make sense to lump these composers together historically. They're all roughly the same age. They were all friends. They all constantly worked and moved in the same circles. And they did share at least some common stylistic characteristics. They were disciples of Jean Cocteau, Eric Satie. They all rebelled against the overt sentimentality of the previous generation of French Impressionist composers, people like Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel. They all ascribed to this idea put forth by Eric Satie of la clarté, simplicity, not that different from what people call neoclassicism. So yes, it's true their music is different, but they do share some commonalities. What I want to do next is I want to show you a brief video clip of an interview with Darius Milhaud's wife, Madeleine Milhaud, who for many years was kind of the steward of her husband's legacy. Let me talk a little bit about Madeleine Milhaud. She was both Darius Milhaud's wife and his cousin. Her father was from the same town the Milhauds were from, so not a very distant relation. They married in 1925 and were married for his entire life. And she lived to be 106 years old. She passed away in 2008. And indeed, much of what we know about Darius Milhaud comes through Madeline. So, by the way, she would teach French literature and theater at Mills College in California, where Darius Milhaud, spoiler alert, would teach for many decades. They had one son, Daniel Milhaud, who was a painter, who passed away in 2014. So I'm going to show you this brief clip where she talks a bit about Les Six, about this group of musicians Darius Milhaud was kind of lumped in with. This is, of course, in French, but there is closed captioning. All right, let me get this queued up properly. Bear with me. Okay, here we go.
Les six, il y avait Honegger et Darius qui étaient au conservatoire en même temps. Moi, j'ai fait la connaissance d'Arthur quand j'avais 12 ans. Parce qu'ils allaient au conservatoire ensemble. Et que mon père avait loué pour nous, au début de la guerre, un rez-de-chaussée. Donc Darius passait devant la fenêtre, tapait à la porte. C'est comme ça que j'ai connu Honegger. Taillefer avait tous les prix. Elle était remarquable comme étudiante. Poulenc et Auric avaient la même génération. C'était beaucoup plus jeune. Duret, n'en parlons pas. Non, ce qui est assez étonnant, c'est que ils se sont toujours entendus. Ils ne se sont jamais disputés. Germaine était vraiment assez merveilleuse parce que c'est pas facile d'être dans un groupe avec 4 hommes, 5 hommes. Et ne pas essayer d'être masculine. Elle a gardé toutes ses qualités féminines. Ça, c'est remarquable.
All right. We'll leave that there. She's 102 in that interview right there, which is quite remarkable. Musically, during this time period, there are several things that are noteworthy about Darius Milhaud. First of all, he becomes a leading exponent of the compositional device known as polytonality. And without getting too much into the weeds, I want to talk a little bit about polytonality because Milhaud becomes so closely identified. I mean, to this day, if you study classical composition at a conservatory, when you get to the technique of polytonality, you will undoubtedly talk about Darius Milhaud. And polytonality was the idea of using multiple key centers simultaneously. And it was kind of a way of pushing the bounds of traditional tonality, traditional harmony, without abandoning it completely, like atonality or the serialists or like Milhaud's friend Arnold Schoenberg would do. Let me give you some really rudimentary examples of polytonality. And this is kind of silly, but I think it's a good illustration. So, two simple ways, two good examples of polytonality. You can have two keys existing at the same time. I can go to the piano here. I'm a terrible pianist, by the way. And I'm going to play Mary Had a Little Lamb, because everyone knows how Mary Had a Little Lamb. And my left hand is going to be in D major, and my right hand is going to be in C major. Let's see if I can pull this off. Beautiful, isn't it? But it's a way of kind of stretching the bounds of traditional tonality without completely abandoning it. Look, another way, I can alternate keys. Let's see, I'll play Mary Had a Little Lamb again, or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star again, and I'm going to alternate between B flat major and E major, two very distant keys. All right. But most famously, Darius Milhaud would be the first significant classical composer in Europe to embrace American jazz. He first heard a little bit of jazz in London when he was over there in 1920, but then he took his first concert tour of the United States in 1922. And when he gets to the US, he wants to hear jazz. In fact, there are some funny stories that when he first gets over here, you know, the people who are hosting him and take him around, you know, they say, "What do you want to do?" He says, "I want to go hear jazz." So they take him to hear the Paul Whiteman Orchestra. And Darius Milhaud says something to the effect of, "I don't know a lot about jazz, but I'm pretty sure that's not it." Well, look, let me read you some of what Darius Milhaud wrote about this trip in his autobiography, and I'll dissect some of this as well. And of course, I'm reading this in translation. "When I arrived in New York, I had told the newspapermen interviewing me that European music was considerably influenced by American music. But whose music, they asked me, McDowell or Carpenter's? Those are two kind of forgotten American composers of the time." Back to the quote. "Neither the one or the other," I answered. "I mean jazz." They were filled with consternation, for at that time most American musicians had not realized the importance of jazz as an art form and relegated it to the dance hall. The headlines given to my interviews prove the astonishment caused by my statements. "Milhaud admires jazz," or "Jazz dictates the future of European music." Of course, my opinions won me the sympathy of Negro music lovers who flocked to my concerts. The chairman of the Negro Musicians Union even wrote me a touching letter of thanks. Little suspecting what complications this would cause, I immediately invited him to lunch, but no restaurant would serve us. I want to read you a different excerpt where Darius Milhaud talks about the jazz he actually got to hear when he finally got into Harlem. And I'm going to dissect this a little bit. "Harlem had not yet been discovered by the snobs and aesthetes. We were the only white folks there. The music I heard was absolutely different from anything I had ever heard before and was a revelation to me. Against the beat of the percussion, the melodic lines crisscrossed in a breathless pattern of broken and twisted rhythms. A negress whose grating voice seemed to come from the depths of the centuries sang in front of various tables. With despairing pathos and dramatic feeling, she sang over and over again, to the point of exhaustion, the same refrain to which the constantly changing melodic pattern of the orchestra wove a kaleidoscopic background." Look, what's he describing there? He says she's singing with a grating voice with despair and pathos, the same refrain over and over. That's the blues. He's hearing someone sing the blues. All right, let me continue reading. "This authentic music had its roots in the darkest corners of the Negro soul, the vestigial traces of Africa, no doubt. Its effect on me was so overwhelming that I could not tear myself away. From then on, I frequented other Negro theaters and dance halls. In some of their shows, the singers were accompanied by a flute or a clarinet, two trumpets, a trombone, or a complicated percussion section played by one man." What's he saying? A complicated percussion section played by one man. That's a drum set. Again, in France, no one had seen anything that looked like a drum set yet. When I went back to France, I never wearied of playing over and over on a little portable gramophone shaped like a camera, Black Swan Records, that was a black-owned record label in Harlem, that I had purchased in a little shop in Harlem. More than ever, I was resolved to use jazz for a chamber music work. Well, he got his chance, because he had the perfect commission not long after this trip to allow him to utilize this new sound. There we go. And the commission was a commission from the Ballet Suédois, the Swedish ballet, to collaborate with the French writer Blaise Cendrars on a ballet version of the creation myth. Well, they decided to make this ballet kind of African themed, with African themed decor and costumes by Fernand Léger, and the music, Darius Milhaud decided, would be influenced by jazz. He writes, "At last in La Création du Monde, I had the opportunity I'd been waiting for to use these elements of jazz to which I had devoted so much study. I adopted the same orchestra as used in Harlem, 17 solo instruments, and I made wholesale use of the jazz style to convey a purely classical feeling." Now, I'm going to play some of La Création du Monde for you in a minute. This is Darius Milhaud's most famous work. It's the work that's most often performed to this day, usually just as a concert piece, rarely as the actual ballet for which it was originally scored. Now, one thing I love to talk about is the remarkable similarity in many ways between La Création du Monde and George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. But I want to make sure I'm very clear. I am not in any way trying to imply that either of these composers stole or borrowed from the other. In fact, it's virtually impossible that these two gentlemen were aware or have heard of each other's works in the short 3.5 months that separated the premiere of La Création du Monde in Paris and then the premiere of Rhapsody in Blue at Aeolian Hall in New York. It is purely coincidental that there are a lot of remarkable similarities between these two works. I mean, they both combine jazz and classical music in a concert work. They're both one-movement works. Depending on the tempos you take, they're about the same length. They're both scored for these kind of scaled-down chamber groups. Gershwin's work was scored for the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, which was like a jazz band but within a string section, or you can think of it as a string or a small chamber orchestra that's heavy on the brass and woodwinds. La Création du Monde had a more unusual instrumentation. I'll give that to you in a minute, but it's similar instrumentation. Even some of the melodic material is somewhat similar in these two works. Now again, that is purely coincidental, but it is absolutely remarkable that these two composers, George Gershwin and Darius Milhaud, with such different backgrounds, arrived at such similar places musically at almost the same exact time. And perhaps it's not coincidental that the one real commonality between George Gershwin and Darius Milhaud was that they were both Jewish. All right, a few more things about La Création du Monde before I play an excerpt for you. It's one movement, 6 continuous dance scenes. Yeah, there's the instrumentation. 2 violins, cello, double bass, 2 flutes, oboe, 2 clarinets, bassoon, alto, saxophone, French horn, 2 trumpets, trombone, piano, percussion. My favorite part, and I think everyone's favorite part of La Création du Monde, is towards the end, Darius Milhaud basically writes a little jazz fugue, meaning he takes a little musical motif, a very jazzy motif. I'll play it for you. That's it. That's the little motif. I'll play it again. And he takes that and treats it fugally, putting it through all these different transpositions and permutations. I'm making this up. This is not actually how it goes, but you know. that sort of thing. Anyway, I'm going to play you part of this work, the part with the jazz fugue. I fully encourage you to go listen to this in its entirety if you have not already heard it. This is the Orchestre de Chambre de Lausanne, conducted by Alberto Zeta. It's a 1990 recording, and I'm going to start in the middle. Bear with me. This is an audio-only share, by the way. I do not have video for this, so you will just hear the audio. All right, I'll leave it there. That's about a third of La Creation Du Monde. I truly, if you're not familiar with it, go listen to it in its entirety. If you are familiar with it, go listen to it again. It's absolutely wonderful. It's absolutely magnificent. And like I said, it's incredible that it premieres in Paris 3.5 months, October 25th. 1923, and then February 14th or February something in next year is when Rhapsody in Blue premieres. Now, of the reception of La Création du Monde, Darius Milhaud wrote, and I think this might be a slight overstatement on his part, but he writes, "The critics decreed that my music was frivolous and more suitable for a restaurant or a dance hall than for the concert hall. 10 years later, the self-same critics were discussing the philosophy of jazz and learnedly demonstrating that La Création was the best of my works." I don't know whether that's entirely true. My understanding is it was pretty well received when it premiered. And in fact, France and Europe in general, as you know, throughout much of the 20th century, has a long love affair with American jazz and American music. Well, this ballet score is one of the important milestones on this. This helps introduce jazz in many corners of French culture, and pretty soon they'll get a hankering for the real thing. While we were playing that, I got a chance to scroll through the chat a bit. So before I go any further, let me address a few things in the chat in order. Aaron asked, what's the meaning of my album title, Clown with a Stick? That actually came from a derisive comment someone made on one of my YouTube videos of a live performance that I gave. There's lots of videos of me on YouTube. And someone commented on the video, "The clown with the stick seems really happy with himself," which kind of made me laugh for a couple of reasons. First of all, I figured whoever this guy was doesn't know much about artists, because pretty much every musician and artist I know is filled with constant self-doubt and even self-loathing. So the idea of a musician being happy with himself kind of cracked me up. But I did like his phrase, clown with a stick, so I decided to borrow that. Okay, now, some people have made some very excellent and much needed corrections of some things I said. First of all, Aix-en-Provence is not in central France, says Stanley. It is just a few miles from Marseille. You are right. You are right. And my knowledge of French geography is pretty woefully inadequate. It's probably a lot like how people tend to call anything that is not New York City upstate New York. Much to the chagrin of people who are actually from upstate New York. And yes, I should not have said Provençal is a dialect. It's a language in and of itself. There's French influence, but it is its own language, much like Yiddish. So thank you for that clarification. And then someone did put in a wonderful link to an actual website about Judeo-Provençal from the Jewish Language Project. And that looks fascinating. I'm going to take a closer look at that later, so I appreciate that. Some information about Schoenberg's scores. Paul Claudel was the brother of Camille Claudel, Rodin's muse, model, and lover. Excellent. Yes. Oh, I'm going to get to Darius Milhaud's famous students momentarily. In fact, Bob, that is a perfect segue for what I'm going to get to next. So, yes, in 1940, Darius and Madeleine Milhaud are forced to flee France right before the Nazis take over. And he comes in exile to the United States. His friend, another prominent French Jewish conductor and composer, Pierre Monteux, was the conductor of the San Francisco Symphony, and he arranges for Darius Milhaud to get a job as a composition instructor at Mills College in Oakland. And I will talk about his students in a few minutes. But let me just say, so during the war, both Darius Milhaud's parents die of natural causes, but it's very painful and naturally upsetting for him, that he can't be there. And the Nazis apparently burn much of his scores and much of his home. He does return to France for 2 years to teach at the Paris Conservatoire after the war. And that's when he writes this book. And this autobiography is really a fascinating book because it's actually pretty dark and grim. Because when Darius Milhaud writes this book, it's just after the devastation of World War II. News of the horrors of the Holocaust are starting to come to light. He's lost both of his parents, he's lost his home, and he's in pretty poor health. He's in a wheelchair by this point and would be in a wheelchair for much of the rest of his life. I mean, he basically writes this book as if he's someone who is nearing the end of his life's journey. I mean, he doesn't say it explicitly, but that's the sense you get from reading this autobiography. He is writing this on the boat as he's traveling back to France, kind of thinking his life is coming to a close. And the reader knows something the author doesn't know, which is that there is a whole fabulous second chapter to his life. And yes, he would write a second autobiography. This original autobiography is called Notes Without Music. Yes. So the reader knows something the author doesn't know. There's this whole wonderful second chapter of his life. Yes, he'll go back to France for 2 years, but after that, he'll return to Mills College, where he will continue to compose, and his pupils at Mills College include some of the biggest names of American music. Dave Brubeck, Peter Schickli, better known as P.D.Q. Bach, William Bochum, Simon Sargon, who wrote so much wonderful Jewish music, Philip Glass, Stephen Reich, Burt Bacharach. Burt Bacharach said Darius Milhaud told him, "Don't be afraid of writing something people can remember and whistle. Don't ever feel discomforted by a melody." Dave Brubeck, in particular, would cite Darius Milhaud as one of his most important influences. Indeed, Dave Brubeck's eldest son is named Darius, after Darius Milhaud. You know, for composers like Dave Brubeck and Burt Bacharach and others, Darius Milhaud was the ideal composition teacher for them, because he was really probably one of the few American composition teachers at this time who taught, traditional classical composition, but didn't look down upon jazz and other popular music. Darius Milhaud used to talk about how Dave Brubeck used to talk about how when he was studying with Darius Milhaud, would encourage him to have a career in jazz. He said, if you play jazz, you can work, you can eat if you play this music. He might not have gotten that advice from many other composition teachers in America during that time period. I want to show you a couple of other video clips that will allow us to continue our discussion in several different ways. First, I want to show you an excerpt from a wonderful short 1958 documentary called A Visit with Darius Milhaud. And I'm going to show you a segment when some of his students, including Dave Brubeck, and Bill Smith, who played with Dave Brubeck for many years, come to visit Darius and Madeline Milhaud in their home. And a couple of things about this clip before I show it to you. First of all, I apologize. This is the best clip I could find of this. I have not been able to find it on DVD. It's on YouTube. The sound is pretty bad. In fact, I'm going to stop this not long after the actual music starts because the music is almost painful to listen to. The sound is so distorted. But you'll see Dave Brubeck. You'll see him talk about Darius Milhaud. By the way, this is 1958. Dave Brubeck is pretty well established at this point, is a fairly successful jazz musician, but he is yet to release the Time Out album in 1955, which featured his massive breakthrough hit, Take 5. So Dave Brubeck is successful, but he is nowhere near the kind of famous figure and almost household name he would become in just a year's time when this is filmed. All right, let me show you just a little bit of this documentary, and then we'll continue.
The Milhaud home is enlivened by a steady stream of informal visitors. For Milhaud, like so many creative artists who are far ahead of their time, is considered one of their own by the younger generation. Darius Milhaud was the first serious musician to become interested in jazz, and as early as 1923, he incorporated this form of music in his ballet, The Creation of the World. Here now to meet the Milhauds are several of his former students, whom he affectionately calls his Mills College boys. Included in this group are Jack Weeks, Bill Smith, Dick Collins, Dave Van Crete, and Dave Brubeck. Teacher Milhaud filled them with counterpoint and polytonality. But says Brubeck, he also advised us to stick to jazz. Otherwise, we would be working out of our own field and not taking advantage of our American heritage.
All right, I got to stop it there. Sorry, the music is just so distorted and painful to listen to. Okay, the next clip I want to show you is a really fun one for a lot of reasons. Let me give you some background on what I'm about to show you. Let me get this queued up. This is a bit of a special that was filmed for WWII in San Francisco of a performance at Mills College of an earlier piece that Darius Milhaud had written in 1921, dedicated to a fellow member of Les Six, George Gershwin, that featured jazz. He called it Caramel Mou. And a couple of things to talk about this clip before I show it to you. First of all, it's a musical setting of a poem by Jean Cocteau, and actually in the clip I will show you, Madeline Milhaud, who was also on the faculty of Mills College, will read the translation of this poem by Jean Cocteau, which is in and of itself fairly amusing, and then you'll hear the performance. Now, they interrupt the performance with a couple of biographical things, including, again, a brief interview segment with Dave Brubeck, who by this point in 1963 is much more well-known, is very famous, and is probably a big name to talk about Darius Milhaud. Let me show this to you. This is a fun little sequence to show you, because it gives you a chance to see both Darius and Madeline Milhaud and to hear them talk about this poem and this work, Caramel Blue.
It was the most exciting period that I had had the joy of living through. It was just after the First World War, and everything seemed possible because we all had a great hope that the World War were ended forever. There was a period of joy, of really it was peace coming. And during all the experiences that we did at this time, the jazz appeared coming from America and had a very shaking influence. Then everybody was very much intrigued by all the rhythms and the new timbres that came to Europe from Broadway or from Harlem. And a lot of musicians were interested by the handling all those possibilities. Stravinsky made his wonderful ragtime for 11 instruments, and I had always the idea to try to take the jazz out of the dancing hall to bring it in the concert hall, which later I did with the Creation Du Monde. But to try a little experience, I wrote a shimmy, which was the dance rather à la mode in the 20s. And it's not really a shimmy like the shimmies that you could hear at this time. It is perhaps, I would say, the same difference that you have between a photograph and a portrait made by a contemporary painter. It's the photograph. It is not the photograph of a shimmy. It is the portrait of a shimmy. And for that, as in the jazz bands of these times, there were always a little song which was hummed by one of the musicians. Jean Cocteau wrote a little poem to add in this little shimmy, which is very Dadaist-minded, and which also made the piece more a portrait of shimmy. But I insist a little bit on that, but I think I wanted to do it. And then we made a rough translation of this poem that Madeleine is going to read you.
Well, you all know what caramel mou means, I suppose. Soft candy or soft caramel. Take a young girl, fill her up with ice and gin, shake it up to make an androgyne, and send her back to her family. Hello? Operator? Don't disconnect me. Don't connect me. Don't connect me. Don't. Oh, how sad it is to be the king of animals. Oh, love is the greatest of all pains. Take a young girl, put on her lips a dash of bitter, and shake it all, and send her back to her family. I know a man who was so unhappy in love that he played Chopin's nocturnes on the drum. Hello, operator? Don't disconnect me. I was speaking to... Take a young girl, fill her up with ice and gin. Don't you think that art is a little... Shake it up to make an androgyne and send her back to her family. One says to the child, wash your hands. One doesn't say, wash your teeth. Caramel mou.
Now, my wife told you that caramel mou means a soft caramel, but also it is related to the folklore of the theater. because in 1920 we didn't have those little chocolate ice cream called Eskimo glacé, and during the intermissions we could hear all the ushers saying caramel mou, bonbon acidulé, pastille de menthe, entr'acte. And now caramel mou.
Milhaud probably was the first classical composer to use the jazz idiom, and I don't think it's ever been used better since, I'm referring to Creation of the World, than he used it.
Dave Brubeck, the jazz composer and pianist, is a former student of Milhaud's.
Because he seemed to use it just at the correct time in his own development, in the development of jazz, and the way it could be a new, fresh spirit in classical music.
Remplissez la glace de gin, secouez le tout pour en faire une autre gin et rendez-la à sa famille. Allô, allô, mademoiselle, ne coupez pas, demoiselle, ne coupez pas, demoiselle, ne coupez pas, demoiselle, ne coupez pas.
All right, we'll leave that there. My apologies for cutting that short. Okay, I just want to quickly point out, because I know we're starting to run out of time. As I mentioned earlier, Darius Milhaud was very prolific, and there's actually only a handful of pieces that are overtly Jewish, but there are some, and they're very significant. We already talked about the poem Juif. He wrote an opera for the Israel Festival, based on David. He wrote a Service or Sacra, a wonderful Sabbath morning service that was commissioned and in 1947 premiered in San Francisco. He never got to go to Israel, mostly because of his health issues, but he did receive the Israel Cultural Award from the Israel Bond Organization in 1963. But what I wanted to make sure to highlight is his final work. If you remember, the poem Juif was Opus 34, I think. Yes, Opus 34, but his final work, Opus 441, is a musical composition based on Ani Ma'amim. You know, Ani Ma'amim, Un chant perdu et retrouvé, a song lost and found, with text by Elie Wiesel. And it was premiered in 1973 at Carnegie Hall, conducted by Lucas Faust. And I want to just play a little bit of a recording for you of this. It's also a wonderful work, and again, very overtly Jewish. This recording is actually, I should have it in front of me. This recording is from a few years later. This is not the original premiere. And the narrator here is Michael Lonsdale. or Michel Lonsdale, a French actor. I only mention him because he's the villain in the absolute worst James Bond movie ever made. I don't know if you're a James Bond connoisseur like myself, but I think it's indisputable. Moonraker, the worst one of them all. It is so bad, it rises to the level of high art, in my opinion. But that's a discussion for a completely different seminar. Let me play you just a little bit of this recording. Bear with me. Here we go. I'll do the screen share just so you can see the album cover, because I didn't have the information in front of me.
Ani Ma'amin, tu es Dieu, créateur des mondes, libérateur des hommes. J'étais le premier à le dire, le premier à le hurler, le premier à te découvrir, à te faire connaître. En ce temps-là, Seigneur, j'étais seul comme toi. On se moquait de moi, on se moquait de toi, torturé à cause de toi, fidèle à toi, Annie,
I apologize. I'm going to stop this now. All right, look, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the end of our time, so I want to make sure I say a few things before I scroll through and see if there are any final questions or comments. So first of all, let me say my usual thank yous. Big thanks to the Jewish Study Center for bringing me in and again for lots of different programs. I really appreciate it. They're a wonderful organization. Big thanks to Jerry Garfinkel and Mindy Reiser. And look, go to jewishstudycenter.org, find out about more programs, sign up for their email list, and most importantly, if you can, make a donation to support their work, because they offer all these programs for free, which is really a beautiful thing. And then they put them up on YouTube after the fact so people can continue to see these programs for free. And they do so many great programs on a variety of topics. So again, jewishstudycenter.org. Check it out. Big thanks to them. Look for me. I'm around. If you're in the Mid-Atlantic region, I perform all over. I occasionally tour beyond. The best way to find out about me is go to sethkibel.com, and you can learn more about me there. Shockingly enough, that domain name wasn't taken. I mean, honestly, I've got an unusual name. So you type me into anywhere, you're going to find me pretty quickly, whether it's, YouTube or Spotify or Amazon or Facebook or Twitter. But this has information on my recordings and I'm giving an online lecture on Wednesday, January 15th. And you can find out about me more that way. In fact, while I'm at it, let me put up the Jewish Study Center website for you to look at too. There it is, jewishstudycenter.org. Lots of great things. Make sure you go to this website after you're done and can see about their current scheduled classes, and there's a donate button right there. Okay, having done that, let me see if there's final stuff. Oh, Scaramouche. I made certain editorial decisions, so I left out Scaramouche, which is another very famous composition by Darius Milhaud. It's also, by the way, one of the compositions that best exemplifies his use of the technique of polytonality. If you are studying classical, modernist, 20th century composition at a conservatory, and you get to the topic of tonality, you're going to talk about Scaramouche. Now, Scaramouche was written in 1937. It was compiled together from some music I think he had written for plays, like incidental music. And it was originally written, I believe, as a piano duo, 2 pianos, 4 hands. But it has been reorchestrated by Darius Milhaud himself many different times. One of the most famous incarnations is for alto saxophone and orchestra. And in the small but narrow exclusive world of classical saxophone, Darius Milhaud's Scaramouche for alto saxophone and orchestra is one of the most famous compositions. Every classical saxophonist plays it at some point. There's also a clarinet version, because Benny Goodman was jealous of this piece, so he had Darius Milhaud rework it for clarinet and orchestra. But yes, that's one piece I didn't get to. If I had an extra 15 minutes, I would check it out. And yes, he wrote a second autobiography, My Happy Life, towards the end of his life. Okay, I don't know about the artwork on that album cover. I apologize. I don't. I think that's it. Did I miss anything? Jerry, Mindy, keep me honest. Anything else I should talk about?
Yes, Seth, that was really fascinating. And I think we've all learned an enormous amount about a composer most of us really barely knew. I'm fascinated by the interchange with what are now called African Americans, but would be called Negroes in the time of Milhaud. Say a little bit more about that interaction. How did the Black community respond to this in the United States? What about Africans in France? Because, of course, France was a colonial power in Africa. Were they pleased at this? Did they have any critique, any reservations? So please speak to that encounter of worlds.
I'll give a few thoughts on it, and this is a little out of my wheelhouse, because these issues get very complicated. I will talk about, first of all, how in France, on the surface, people sometimes talk about how Black American musicians, would go over and tour, and they encountered significantly less racism, institutionalized, than they did in the United States. And that's true, but it's complicated because there was a tendency in France to elevate Black culture, but elevate it in an almost, I think there's almost the appropriate fetishization, if you will. And you get a sense of that even in La Creation Du Monde. I'm not trying to take anything away from Darius Milhaud, but the whole ballet was African-themed, primitive culture, primitive dance, primitive costumes, and that's the music that goes with it. And while they did... the same thing kind of happened when you read about Josephine Baker in France. She was celebrated. She was heralded as a hero. She was, worshipped, but in a certain way, in a certain kind of fascination they had with what they saw as African culture. So it's a very complicated issue. Now, I will say, Black American jazz musicians, many of them greatly appreciated French composers like Darius Milhaud, who were incorporating jazz into their work. I mean, the most famous example would be Duke Ellington, who was very aware of what Darius Milhaud was doing and very much loved it, and talked about how he listened to Darius Milhaud and thought it was wonderful how he incorporated jazz into his compositions. So these are really fascinating issues. Yeah, and someone's asking in the chat again about, again, I know we could talk about it endlessly, how the remarkable similarity between Rhapsody in Blue and La Création du Monde, premiering 3.5 months apart, albeit separated by an ocean. And it's really interesting because Gershwin and Darius Milhaud, apart from the fact they were Jewish, had very different backgrounds. I mean, George Gershwin was hearing jazz all the time. I mean, he was surrounded by it. He was spending night after night in Harlem hearing this music. He was listening to recordings. He was going to hear all the leading jazz musicians of the day. Darius Milhaud's exposure to jazz was much more limited. A handful of things he heard in London, which probably weren't even that authentic, and then what he was able to hear during his month-long trip to America in 1922, and those handful of records he brought back to him. That was his entire exposure to American jazz, which, was far more limited than what George Gershwin were able to be exposed to. Yet they arrived at this remarkably similar place musically. It really is interesting and quite fascinating. The racial issues with France and people of color and America, as you well know, that's a whole field of research and study in and of itself, and I'm probably woefully that's way below my pay grade to offer really informed commentary on those issues. Anything else, Mindy or Jerry? It is 8:31, so...
Well, okay. Say a little bit more about the final years of Darius Milhaud's life. Did he do much speaking? What was his relationship with his students as they got older, as he got older?
He still taught almost up until the end, and he still composed almost up until the end of his life. But because of health issues, he did not travel much. He lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, I forget exactly where, and people would come to see him. And Dave Brubeck talked about how he kept on going to visit him, and other famous students of his would visit him regularly and pay pilgrimage to see him. But he did not travel much because of health issues. And then, as I mentioned, another remarkable part is that Madeline outlived him by some, 30 years or so? I mean, she lived to be 106. It passed away in 2008? I don't have my notes in front of me. But she lived a remarkably long time, 2008, and really became the steward of his legacy for several decades of his passing. And much of the resources and kind of legacy of Darius Milhaud we owe to his wife's careful stewardship as well.
Okay, Jerry?
Well, first, I want to thank you again, Seth, for a great presentation, including performance. You do that all the time, but it's still wonderful. You have done a number of classes for us. They've all been good, and most of them have been great. In terms of classes in the future, right now, there's nothing on the schedule. If you go to our website, you won't find any classes. The only one that's currently scheduled is our annual Halatka Hamantashen debate, which will be on February 26th, about 2 weeks before Purim. I haven't put that on the website yet. And that's usually one of our most popular classes. And I expect that this year it'll be at Ahadas Israel as usual, but also be live streamed. We're working on a sort of multi-session class, a series of sessions on Sephardic history, which I think sounds wonderful to me. We were going to have, a week from today, a class on Portuguese Marranos, but that's been expanded into a long history, or at least 5-session history of Sephardim. So it won't be next week. And there are other classes we're working on, but have not been able to schedule yet. So everyone who did register will be on our mailing list unless you take yourself off, and you be informed of classes as they come in. So the only one that's scheduled right now is February 26th, the Latka Hamantash debate. We're busy recruiting debaters right now. So if you have some suggestions, just email me at info@jewishstudiescenter.org. And I have to thank you many times, Seth. I mean, I had never heard of Darius Milhaud. I didn't even know how to pronounce his name. I knew so little about him, but I know, I don't know a lot about him now. Obviously, I know a lot more than I did before. And I will tell Jonina that you will look up the Provence Yiddish page. Jonina is a good friend of mine. Okay, so I think I'm going to end things now, and I hope to see you all at the debate and what other classes we do. The Sephardic history class should be a wonderful class also. Any last words for either Mindy or Seth?
No, just thank you everyone for joining me. I appreciate it.
Okay.
It's been really.
It's been a great class. As usual. Okay, bye everyone. Oh, this will be posted in a day or two, and you all get emails. And maybe, Seth, you could send me some information that I might want to either include in the email or post on our website as more information about Milhaud. Okay.
Au revoir.
What?
Au revoir. See you again.
Au revoir. Okay. Bye-bye.